Okay, hi everybody and welcome to today's webinar, Data Privacy and Protection, a Logical Extension to DevOps. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. All of the attendees for today's session will be on mute throughout the presentation, but I really do want to hear your questions. So in the GoToWebinar panel on your screens, you should see a section where you can tap in your questions, and I'll make sure that we've got some time towards the end of the presentation so that we can go through those afterwards. Make sure we get you the answers that you need. If we do for any reason run out of time today, don't worry, we'll be sure to get back to you with answers to any of those questions. Now, today's presentation will be recorded, and we'll make sure that we make available the recording of the entire presentation along with the slide deck as well. So please do not worry if you're frantically scribbling down notes. We'll make all of that content available to you shortly after the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's crack on and I'll introduce myself. So my name is Tom Austin. I'm Head of Pre-Sales Engineering at Redgate Software. I look after typically the EMEA and APAC regions, working with our customers who are moving towards typically DevOps practices and approaches. I mean, everywhere I go these days, somebody's talking about DevOps. In fact, even at the dentist the other day, there was a conversation going on in the waiting room around DevOps. And hot on the heels of that is, of course, this topic of the upcoming GDPR legislation that also seems to be everywhere I turn. So I thought, what better way of bringing these two topics together than doing a session, an online webinar, where we could look at where these two are going to overlap and how we can extend one to embrace the other without compromise on either side. So my history, if you like, I've worked at Redgate for around about 10 years now. I've always focused on our SQL Server tools, more recently expanding that into the Oracle space with Redgate's Oracle offering. And I'm really excited to see how we can take some of the technologies that Redgate's had for a little while and combine that with some of our newer acquisitions and newer products that we've put together to actually bring a full solution out in this particular space. For those of you who aren't familiar with Redgate, Redgate is around about 230 employees altogether. We're spread across 3 main offices, 2 over in the US and a headquarters here in the UK, in Cambridge, UK. We're about 18 years old and have around about 200,000 customers. I think we're fast approaching the 1 million user mark as well. Last year, I asked for a look into this to see, of those customers, of those organizations that are using the tools, how many people are actually using the products, and it's certainly creeping up in that direction. We sponsor various community resources as well, things like user groups. We have community outreach through our SQL Server Central and SimpleTalk websites. And through those channels, we actually attract over 4 million website visitors each and every year, so huge audience that we can speak to about these topics. And of course, it doesn't stop there for us. We're a provider of tools, so the important thing is that actually we provide tools which can help organizations achieve their objectives in this space. And you can see in the bottom left corner there, 91% of Fortune 100 organizations are currently using Redgate's tools. So that's enough to introduce me and Redgate for those of you who are less familiar. Let's get back to the topic in hand: data privacy and protection, a logical extension to DevOps. Now, the first thing for us to do really is to start by defining what we mean by DevOps. Now, I've seen 101 different DevOps presentations, and throughout those presentations, I've seen at least 101 different definitions. But for me personally, I prefer to lean towards Donovan Brown's definition, which we can see on the screen here. So DevOps is the union of people, process, and product to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. Now, there's a whole bunch of different webinars around DevOps as a database topic on the Redgate website, but specifically today we're looking at how this crosses over into that data privacy space. Now, it's important to note, of course, that DevOps is not something you can just decide to do tomorrow. You can't go to a tools provider and buy DevOps. It's a shift, it's a transition, and it needs the right guidance to become a reality, really. Now, as part of this shift, we often discover that waiting until the point of release to see how our software behaves is often a key cause of chaotic or even catastrophic software releases. And instead, what we should be doing is establishing production-like environments with realistic data sets for use in the development and testing process. Now, this has been a challenge for many organizations, but actually as we increase our ability to deliver value at speed, we should not be accepting any decrease in reliability. So we can see that the need to bake quality in by ensuring those realistic configurations and data sets are shifted left, to borrow from the DevOps handbook. It's never been higher. And the DevOps movement recognizes that. We need to have these testing environments that are as similar as possible to our production databases. And that's why data privacy absolutely has a role to play in DevOps. And successful data governance programs can be the key to ensuring that all of the relevant people and processes, combined with the right tools, of course, are aligned and delivering maximum value to the business without compromising on that security. So if that's helped us to define DevOps, what are the requirements that we must adhere to as we look to make this shift? Well, firstly, we have specific requirements from legislation, such as the topic you can see on the screen here. So data protection by design and by default. So if we look closely at what we mean by this, what we're suggesting is that there's a general obligation to implement technical and organizational measures to show that you have considered and integrated data protection into your processing activities. Now, privacy by design is nothing new. It's always been an implicit requirement of the data protection that the UK Information Commissioner's Office has consistently championed, but now it features as a key requirement under GDPR legislation as well. And the key here is to be able to show that you've thought about this up front and taken steps to protect your data. It's too late to come up with a plan after the event. You have to be able to evidence that you've thought about it, you've put the necessary steps in place, and you have a plan of action in the event of any type of issues. You have a process to follow, a set of protocols. Now, if we break this down further, as well as embedding privacy by design into our processes, the GDPR also states that the controller shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures for ensuring that by default only personal data which are necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. So that's quite a sentence here, but essentially what we're talking about is kind of consented and non-consented processing. So when a user gives us their data, we're only allowed to use it for that particular reason. So looking at kind of this list of technical measures that often are touched upon as we talk about data protection and privacy, the most obvious one to jump out to us here is pseudonymization and anonymization. If we can ensure that we have eliminated any personally identifiable information from our data set through various mechanisms before it crosses out of that consented processing domain, then we can evidence that we have no personal data being used for testing purposes. And of course, testing purposes is not typically what a user has agreed to as part of providing us with their data. So it'd be difficult to argue that this was a necessary use of that data, that it was a consented use of that data that's been supplied by the user. And I want to touch upon this area of pseudonymization and anonymization a little bit deeper as we go through the presentation today. Now, usually at this point, this is where many of my customers say, but Tom, wait a minute, we're not based in the EU, so why do I care about this? Why do I care about the upcoming changes? Well, actually, the scope of the GDPR is global. It's not as simple as saying, we're outside the EU, it doesn't apply to us. The legislation is relevant to any organisation that holds data on EU citizens. And it doesn't matter if no money changes hands either. If an organisation offers goods or services or even just monitors the behaviour of an EU citizen, then this falls under the scope of the GDPR. So it does apply to you. If you've got any data in your data sets that are relevant to people, citizens of the EU, then the legislation applies to you too. But it's not just the GDPR that we have to be aware of. This graphic that you can see on the screen now is from global law firm DLA Piper's Data Protection Laws of the World Handbook, the first edition which they launched back in 2012. Now this handbook sets out an overview of the key privacy and data protection laws and regulations across nearly 100 different jurisdictions. And it states within this handbook that they continue to witness a period of unprecedented activity in the development of data protection regulation around the world, which will have a profound impact on the way in which global businesses are required to approach the collection and management of personal data. So, I mean, if you look here, of course, we can see that dark red area around the UK and Europe, where there's heavy regulation via these data protection laws, but actually those can also be seen across the Atlantic in North America, down in Australia, and we can see, you know, quite a rich picture of how these data protection laws are progressing across the globe. So, I mean, these changes are being driven largely by cultural and trade considerations, but also by a struggle to keep pace with the emerging technologies and online business methods. So, you know, take it from me, GDPR is not the only compelling legislative event taking place. Many different parts of the world are already subject to similar rules and regulations. And actually, if you look at the literature that's been produced around the GDPR, many jurisdictions are actually taking it really as a blueprint and copying it with a different title and putting it in place in their own area of operation. So it is a big one. It is being talked about a lot, but it's also being replicated around the globe. Now, because of this desire to bring these data sets back for these development and testing purposes, this really sits right within the domain of expertise of many of Redgate's partners. Many of our customers are concerned with how they can achieve these things. And so we wanted to conduct some research to look a little bit deeper at this problem. So in this recent set of research that we conducted here, we looked to identify how organizations are currently provisioning their databases, and also assess the importance of the provisioning requirements to ensure adherence to these emerging data protection obligations that we've just discussed. So you can download the full copy of this report if you head on to www.red-gate.com/provision report. You can grab the full data set and read about all of the findings. The data set comes from nearly 500 data professionals, and it's from a wide range of different job roles from a variety of different industries. So, you know, it's not just a select bunch, a select few. But what I want to do is share with you, first of all, some of the key findings, and then look into some of these findings in a little bit more depth. So among the key findings, we saw that 63% of organizations have provisioning controlled by the DBA. This didn't surprise me. DBAs are integral to the management of most SQL Server or Oracle infrastructures that we see within organizations. Yes, it's true that there are some new job titles coming around. Data and information controllers are particularly strong, and perhaps they might have some responsibility in this area, but it really didn't surprise me to see that actually most of the responsibility here falls down to the DBAs. What's interesting is that actually only 29% of the respondents allowed individuals to self-serve environments. So that means that typically in most organizations, the bottleneck becomes the DBAs. If the development team wants a new testing environment or development environment to start working on, they have to make a request of the DBA. And this is, you know, this is something I've heard time and time again in the organizations that I've visited, where I ask them about how they get set up with this, and it's, oh, we raise a ticket, and then 2 or 3 days later the DBA says, oh, I've spun up this environment for you, you can go and work with this one. And because of the time it takes to actually create these environments, I often saw that organizations were reluctant to make too many changes or too drastic a type of change to it, because if there was a problem, to get a fresh development environment or a fresh testing environment would take them another 2 or 3 days. So this 29% of people who were able to self-serve and self-create these environments were really leading the way in terms of having that pace to their delivery cycle. Now, in addition to this, 83% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that it is desirable to use production data in development and testing. And again, this I think was something that I've seen time and time again. It makes sense because if during the development and testing phase your developers have a very accurate or very close copy of the production environment, then it eventually leads to less issues when you deploy further up the chain. So whether that be to production or one of the environments that are otherwise late in that chain, you've actually been through the process of updating this database. So often you've found the issues, the complexities, the problems that might rear their head with, I guess, more traditional software integration techniques. And ultimately this allows you to speed up that pace of delivery because you spot the problems early, they can be fixed right away. It's not a case of working on a project for 6 weeks and then going to do a deployment and finding out there's an issue and having to backtrack right to the start to put things right again. So, of course, database provisioning carries its own challenges with its own characteristics, which have not commonly been addressed by provisioning toolsets previously. Some of these include the concerns that we see down the bottom here, so concerns around data security, regulatory compliance, and internal infrastructure such as storage space is a good one. So, not only are we concerned by DBAs having the time to set up these environments, but have they actually got the space to make these environments available as well? It's quite an interesting area to see some results. So actually, with that in mind, what I'd like to do is find out from you guys, from our attendees today, what is your biggest blocker to provisioning databases outside of production? What's the challenge that you'll face? So on your screen now, you should see a poll, and I'll just pause for a moment to see how those results are coming in. Okay, so we'll just give it a moment or two longer. Okay, so that's interesting. So the biggest one we see here currently is data sensitivity. So 50% of people said data sensitivity was their biggest blocker. We have, interestingly, roughly equal amounts of people citing storage concerns and regulatory compliance as their biggest blocker. Only 7% of people actually said that time taken was one of the biggest issues. So maybe you're not concerned about how long it's taking to get these environments spun up. But certainly I don't think it's a massive surprise there that we see this big chunk that is in those top 3 sections: storage concerns, data sensitivity, and regulatory compliance. So let's go back to our slides and let's look into this in a little bit more detail to assess the preferences for using production data in development and testing, and then also at the same time to understand the levels of access respondents have to that production data in their development and testing environments. So on the last slide, we already said that 83% of respondents agree or strongly agree that it is desirable to use production data in development and testing. Interestingly, 76% of DBAs that responded agree with this, as do 87% of application developers. So this is interesting because it suggests that application developers find having production data in development and test more desirable than our subset of DBAs. Now, this might be down to the different responsibilities and concerns that we see with these traditional roles historically, but with the increased adoption of those DevOps practices, the coming together of operations and development, we see more and more collaboration between these two groups. And we can therefore start to look for a solution that fits the objective of both groups, but eases the concerns that the DBA might have in this space about, they're the one that ultimately are responsible for this data set. Additionally, 40% of respondents are restricted from using production data in dev and test. And what's interesting here is that of that 40% that are restricted from using production data, nearly half of them do not use data in development, test and QA environments that has come from production at all because of these restrictions. So nearly half of them are almost working with, pretend environments that don't really represent the environment that they'll likely be deploying to later on. So that's a barrier that we really need to overcome. We want to be able to bring that production-like environment to those teams so that they can actually spot those problems earlier, like we discussed on the previous slides. Fix it quick, fail fast, fix it quick. So unsurprisingly, when we look at the data from, the reasons here, if you're restricted from using production data, why is that? Along similar lines to we saw in the poll earlier, the main reason for restricting use of production data is due to data sensitivity and regulatory requirements. The reasoning was most frequent among certain industries. So finance gave 63% of respondents from the finance sector gave this as their primary restriction, 62% from government and 61% from healthcare organisations. And it proves again that with GDPR or HIPAA or SOX or any other industry regulations, organisations are having to take more caution with how data is used and who has access to it. So we've kind of got a feel for what your blockers are. Now I'd like to find out how you solve this part of the problem. So in our second poll of the webinar today, I'd be interested to find out, where does the data in your dev, test and QA environments comes from? And we'll just spend a couple of moments paused whilst we get some answers to that. Okay, some really interesting results coming through here. Okay, so over 50% of people have responded saying that actually they just use a copy of production for their dev and test databases. Much lower, coming in at less than 30% of people say that they're using a modified copy. So that means the vast majority of people here today are likely to be in breach of these regulations by taking that direct copy of the data that is present in production, which has been consented to be processed for a particular use case, and using it in a way where consent hasn't been gained from the owner of that data. So really interesting. Thank you for your thoughts there. Now this brings me on actually to another area that's quite interesting to think about, because there is definitely a rising tide of data breaches. We hear about a new one every day, it feels like. In the most recent one that I can think of is the MyFitnessPal app. So roughly 150 million users of the app, which was owned by Under Armour, had their personal details leaked in a data breach, including usernames, email addresses and passwords. And Under Armour said it became aware of the breach on the 25th of March, though it actually occurred in late February. So there was this big gap in between the breach occurring and people being able to respond to it. Now, think about the type of data that's been included here. If the hackers were able to match these stolen login credentials to the user's actual fitness data, just imagine what could happen. Having this level of data would allow hackers to know that Mr. Smith has a very specific and predictable pattern of behavior. Because fitness trackers don't just track calories and the number of steps a person walks in a day, it also knows where people are and at what time. And so, you know, we can look at many of the breaches on the screen here, and the impact of these can be huge. These have all happened in the last few years, and undoubtedly larger and more serious breaches lie ahead. But what's interesting is that we've seen time and time again that these breaches can come from production and non-production environments alike. And that's why it's important to reduce your attack surface area by making sure that data is under control in production and at the very least desensitized everywhere else. So that if access is unwittingly granted to a test database or to a development database, all of the data contained within there is not going to be a problem because it's had that level of sensitivity removed from it. So let's look at how much of this maps back to DevOps. We already said that DevOps is about more than just automation, but of course automation still remains a really important part of that DevOps story. We kind of mapped it out as people, product and process. Many people will start with an automation pipeline, much like we can see on the screen here, you know, an automated deployment pipeline where developers make changes to code, which gets checked into the source control repository. That then triggers some kind of automated build process, producing some test results and ultimately probably a release artifact. That gets moved over to a release management phase where a DBA or a release manager can then use those artifacts to deploy those changes out to testing, QA, staging, and ultimately through to production. Now, the GDPR specifies that you have a general obligation to implement technical or organizational measures to show that you have considered and integrated data protection into your processing activities, or, as we mentioned earlier, data protection by design and default. Now, having a reliable and repeatable process in place gives you a really good foundation from which to build your own GDPR defensible position. So actually, this underlying automation pipeline going forward is a great starting point, because whether it's tracking changes to the underlying tables in which the data is actually stored via something like source control in this diagram, or whether it's monitoring the databases that we see on the far right in production, or the servers where the tables are actually being accessed in the real world, DevOps and compliance are going hand in hand to ensure that you're able to deliver value to the end users and customers, but without compromising on good data protection practices, or vice versa. So as a foundation and as a starting point, it means that actually, with a little more thought and some help from the right tooling, it's relatively simple to extend our previous diagram to include the relevant tasks and processes to complete the cycle, to bring this back round to development. So across the top there, we have that familiar automation pipeline for deploying change out, but down the bottom we've extended this to have the reverse process. Once a version deployed to production is in place, we begin monitoring that environment to detect any loss of access or any odd behavior in that production environment. We also then have a backwards chain that allows us to take that environment as a source and provision dev and test environments as copies that have had any sensitive data removed automatically as part of the process. So you know, we're talking about monitoring and provisioning here. Let's take a look at these two stages in a little bit more detail and highlight kind of where the Redgate tools actually fit into this to add value. So first up, we have provisioning. So the the provisioning of database copies to improve that efficiency and improve the quality of database development and testing is increasingly common, as we've already mentioned, with organizations looking to introduce those DevOps practices and shift those environments to the left. Now, working with a copy of the production database enables developers to spot those errors quicker, faster, and prevents the problems further down the chain when we might traditionally have found out about the problem, you know, those long evenings spent worrying about the deployment that's about to happen. It does, however, take a long time and huge amounts of disk space to provision these copies. So what often happens is old copies continue to be used really after they should have been thrown away, and these then become increasingly unreliable, and it's difficult to keep track of where they are and what state they're in and how similar they are to the actual production environment. So and this is multiplied when there's more development teams spread maybe over different geographical areas. There's additional test teams that have different versions of the database for their different area of expertise. It just becomes a mess. And so Redgate provides a SQL provision tool. SQL provision supports a database DevOps approach while keeping compliance central to the process. And this is built up around a couple of bits of technology. So first of all, we have the virtual cloning technology that we see in our SQL clone component. And this means that databases can be created in seconds using just megabytes of storage space, allowing for isolated development databases or the quick provisioning of test database. I was working with a customer the other day who's used exactly this process to spin up copies of their production database as a part of an automated process, test an automated deployment to it, test the automatically generated rollback script, and then check that actually the state that it's left in after the upgrade and the downgrade matches the production environment still. And that all happens automatically as part of their process after a developer commits a change to source control. Now, of course, if we're talking about creating copies of the database, then we need to take care of that sensitive data. And as part of the SQL provision package, sensitive data can be anonymized or replaced with realistic data using SQL Data Masker. And this is to ensure that that data becomes protected as it moves between those environments. And because these two components are combined within a single central management system for the entire provisioning process, that process becomes simple, repeatable, transparent, and most importantly, auditable, so that you can produce evidence of the fact that you've taken those necessary steps to ensure that that data moving back through your environment chain is protected as best it can be. As we saw in the earlier slides, of course, when we conducted that SQL database provisioning survey, 83% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that it's desirable to use production data in development in testing, and with this they can do so knowing that data security, regulatory compliance and storage concerns have been accommodated all in that single SQL provision package. Now, alongside this, of course, we mentioned monitoring. And this is an interesting area because I think people immediately think of one part of monitoring when we talk about this as an important part of the process. And I think this is because once upon a time, a data breach was considered to be an event when a third party had gained unauthorized access to the data that was being held. However, with the new introduction of rules around things like the right to be forgotten, we now have to add to this the fact that an event when you lose access to your own data occurs, it should also be considered a breach. And in the event of a data breach, you should have a predefined response protocol which should be followed. So we've got this problem, you know, the leak of the data or a problem with our environments whereby somebody's gained unauthorized access to that data, as well as the fact that if we cannot access our own data, so that if somebody wishes to be removed, we can remove the records from that data set. Both of these situations really rely on our ability to have real-time information on not only the state of our production environments, but also the activities that are taking place in those production environments, or more specifically, database monitoring. And in terms of Redgate tooling, this is where Redgate's SQL Monitor tool comes in. So SQL Monitor is a web-based monitoring tool that helps teams looking after SQL Server environments to be more proactive. Not only does SQL Monitor alert you to current issues, but it also goes further to give you the information that you need to stop them happening again in the future. More recently, we've made improvements to SQL Monitor which allow it to integrate with Redgate's deployment tools as well. So we saw on the diagram earlier that kind of from left to right process where the ultimate result was a deployment to production. Actually, what we're now doing is placing a marker in the timeline of our monitoring tools to say, hey, there was a deployment that took place at this time. And so it gives context to the information that we're gathering via our monitoring tool. We can see whether or not a deployment took place, where that deployment came from, who carried out that deployment, and what the resulting impact on the performance or the activities that's going on, and help use that to narrow down the source of any issues or problems, or perhaps just areas that we could improve going forward. And that ties it in much more closely with those DevOps practices and processes. We talk about being proactive as well. SQL Monitor automatically baselines information by gathering the data and storing it in a storage repository. And because of that, it's able to do clever things like make predictions about how long it's going to take before you run out of disk space for a particular database or things around that line. So it also allows you to kind of project into the future and see what things you need to start worrying about today so that you don't have problems later on. Now, a great example of someone putting this technology into use is Fiducia. So Fiducia is a German IT service provider. They provide the systems that power over 36,000 ATMs and over 80 million bank accounts in Germany. And back in 2017, it implemented Redgate SQL Monitor to help them to better manage the performance of its growing SQL Server estate, ultimately delivering better customer satisfaction and driving that continued growth of the business. And again, there's a case study on the website from Fiducia, so you can take a look at this and read in much more detail. But some of the interesting points that it pulls out is that, you know, with a growing client base, they needed to significantly increase their SQL Server estate from 30 servers originally back in 2012 all out to 400 servers in 2017. And monitoring this number of servers was proving really difficult for the company's 4 DBAs who, with limited time to check on the servers, were often forced to assume that everything was fine and everything was running well. In fact, Patrick Mayer, one of the 4, said the only way that we knew something was wrong was when a customer called. And you know, I've seen this go 2 ways within organizations. One, there's that case of, well, you know, we'll just assume everything's okay unless somebody tells us differently. But the other extreme is where I've been into organizations where I've spoken to individuals who are responsible for running through a checklist of things in the morning, every morning, to make sure that there's been no degradation in performance or nothing's got worse. And for some people, this took up half their day. So it was lunchtime before they were able to even think about making something better. Half their day, every day, was spent making sure that nothing had got any worse than the day before, which I think is a really disheartening point. You know, imagine if 50% of your time was just spent making sure nothing got any worse. Wouldn't it be better if we could actually focus on making sure that we can improve things and deliver more and make things better? Um, they also, this year they expected another 150 servers to be added to that 400. And so in their mind, they had two options: either significantly increase the DBA headcount to enable them to run through all these checks, or invest in a third-party tool like SQL Monitor. And so, it's great to have a company like this who have experience in this space saying that things like this, doubling the size of our infrastructure every 2 or 3 years, would have been impossible, or certainly extremely difficult, without the capabilities that SQL Monitor offers. So a couple of areas there: provisioning and monitoring. Ultimately, though, what I want to do is leave you with I guess, a process or a set of questions that you can ask yourself to make sure that when you start to extend your processes to ensure compliance, you have the answers to the right questions, I guess. And so here I guess are the four important questions for me. Where is your data? What exactly is your data? Who is accessing your data and for what purpose? And how can you demonstrate adequate protection? Because, of course, it's no good recovering once an event has happened. The stipulation is that you have to have put in steps up front. You have to evidence the fact that you've taken some steps to protect this data. And at Redgate, we categorize these broadly into these four areas: discover, classify, protect, and monitor. And so what do we mean by these four areas? Well, at the top here, you can see this discover and classify is really where we see our SQL Estate Manager tool coming in. So SQL Estate Manager allows you to map your SQL Server estate from production servers to copies for development and test databases, to gain insight into where those databases are and what they contain. So you can see you can do a search to discover where the databases exist, and then start labeling different databases or servers, instances, as sensitive, or and therefore have a catalogue of the data assets that you need to be protective of. And this kind of removes the guesswork in understanding exactly which tables and columns contain that sensitive data for your compliance purposes. So at the very least, the starting point that you can evidence is actually we've identified where we do have sensitive data because we've discovered all of our server instances and we've classified them into personal, non-personal, special, so on and so forth. Interestingly, the Redgate tool actually allows you to export simple reports as well to ensure that you can kind of get alignment across the organization and help deal with things like subject access requests and so on and so forth. Moving round the diagram here, I guess, to that protect section, is once you know where your data is and you've been able to classify it into those kind of subsets of what needs to be protected and what doesn't, then you need to take action on the set of data that does need protecting, and that can be done through a combination of those tools that we mentioned earlier. So at the very basic level, our SQL Backup tool provides encrypted compressed backup so that you can make sure access to the data contained within your backup files is safe. But then we went on to discuss how actually, as we move that data back from the consented processing domain to non-consented, we want to be making sure that for those dev and test environments, we are making available copies of the data which have the sensitive nature removed. And by using a combination of SQL Clone and SQL Data Masker, we're able to do that quickly but safely and securely, automatically applying masking rules when new databases are provisioned or when there's a refresh taking place of development and test environments. And then Finally, round towards the bottom left of the diagram, we have that monitoring stage that we spoke about, where we have SQL Monitor that I mentioned as part of that Fiducia case study, but also SQL Estate Manager comes into play there again. SQL Estate Manager has a whole bunch of capabilities where it can run reports on a scheduled basis, so that it can report back on changes that are important for you as part of planning your processes. So, for example, check the changes to access permissions and things like that. So the combination of these products really come together to provide a complete tool set, and we actually make this available as a collective offering known as the SQL Data Privacy Suite. So I guess in summary, my key tip to take away is remember those 4 questions, and any time at all that you are crossing this big red line down the center of the screen here, you have to make sure that you are able to evidence that you have taken the necessary steps, the necessary precautions to ensure the safety, the protection of your data. If it's consented, then we still have to be careful, we still have to be cautious, we should still monitor these environments to make sure that that data is protected. But the second it crosses that divide back into development or test environments where potentially security is less keen, then take out that sensitive information. Make sure that the data that's contained within them is not personally identifiable information. Instead, make sure that it's safe to be consumed by the dev or test teams or anybody else for that matter. Now, before I move on to the Q&A, I want to let you know about an event that we're hosting. We're hosting a one-day SQL Privacy Summit in London on the 18th of May. And this is exclusive content for senior IT and data managers, where you'll hear more about some of the topics that we've discussed today in this webinar. You'll also get the chance to network with fellow professionals from leading organizations, and there'll be some industry experts there as well that you can grab advice from. You can register by using the URL on the screen, redgate.com/SQL Privacy Summit, and this will actually give you a complimentary ticket. So for anybody that's coming along, you can use that code Janine to grab your complimentary ticket and come along to what I'm really excited by. I think it's going to be a really fantastic event. Please feel free to distribute this to any of your colleagues who you think might also want to attend. I shall see you there. I'll be there myself. I'm running a workshop in the afternoon on how we can use some of these provisioning components. Okay, so I think that kind of covers most of the areas that I wanted to touch on today. So with that in mind, I'm going to open up for questions now. I saw that there's a few questions have come through as we've been talking. I'll just give you a moment to tap in any other questions that you'd like to ask, and then we'll start running through the list. Okay, so a few more questions coming through. Just a couple more. Okay, let's go through some of these then. Okay, so first of all, we have a question here regarding SQL provision. Is there an overhead when accessing masked data from a web application? So interesting question. The answer is no. There's no overhead when accessing masked data. The data is masked at at rest. It's not dynamically masked. So this is static data masking rather than dynamic data masking, where actually as it's read from the database, it's changed and the user cannot see the real data. So actually once the masking process has taken place, the data in the tables is actually masked. And that's typically okay, because in this case what we're not talking about here is provisioning production databases. We're talking about provisioning test and development databases. So we're bringing those databases back from production, where we do need the correct data to be in place, to those environments where we don't need the real data to be there. We just need representative data that is realistic but isn't actually personally identifiable. Now, interestingly, though, that changes, the answer to that question changes slightly if we're talking about a database that has been cloned. Now, because of some of that virtualization technology that we use to make the database copies available almost instantaneously and only taking up a few megabytes of disk space, then there is the potential for there to be a performance impact. But again, because we're not talking about provisioning production databases, we're talking about development and test databases, typically we don't see that impact being too much of a problem. So great question, thank you for that. So we have another question here. Can the masking and cloning tools be run as command line interface, CLI tools? It's certainly possible to automate the process. You can define a provisioning process using some PowerShell commandlets that are made available with the technology. As part of that, you can provide a SQL script that carries out any changes that you need to make in terms of stripping out any production level permissions, as well as providing a masking set from Datamasker, which will be used to remove that sensitive information. So yeah, you can certainly automate this process, much like that diagram that we saw earlier. How big are databases does this work with? So with our provisioning technology, we support databases up to 64 terabytes. And I think the same person asking a follow-on question here, if we have a production database of 1 terabyte size, how long will it take in time to provision a mask? Will it be very slow? It's difficult to say. It depends on, so first of all, if we take the kind of cloning element, if you were to clone it without making any modifications to it, then we'd typically expect that to take about as long as a restore of your database takes from a backup. But it's very difficult for us to suggest how long it will take to add the masking element in, because it depends, of course, how much of the database needs to be masked, how many operations are required to successfully mask the data set. The good news is, though, that there's a free trial of the products available, so you can go and download them. They're not limited in terms of functionality, just limited in terms of time. Is there a tool in the suite that can encrypt or mask data at the production end? No. So again, what we're talking about here is bringing that data back. So it's not about encrypting your production database. For that, you could use things, other things like TDE, I guess. This is all about how do we, when we provision those environments further back in the chain for testing purposes or fresh development environments, how can we make sure that no sensitive data is captured there? So we have a question, a very specific question. Does GDPR say anything about using an email address as an account username? Interesting question. Thanks for that. I'm not familiar with the details on that, so we'll have to get back to you on that. But thank you for pointing that out. how does the privacy suite identify PII data? So at the moment, actually, it's a manual classification process. So we discover all of your data assets, and then you can go through and label the areas that you know to be private information. Although actually, what we are looking into is potentially as a future piece of enhancement to that offering, any ways where we could make that process a lot easier and a lot more automatic for you. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our questions. I'll just give a couple more moments just in case there's anything else. We've got about 5 minutes left. Okay, so it looks like everybody has had their questions answered. If that's not the case, if something comes up later on after you've finished with this webinar and you want to get in touch, please do. You can email us at dataprivacyprotect@red-gate.com, or of course you can head on over to the Redgate website, red-gate.com, and there's a section there dedicated to data privacy and protection. So I think with that, the last thing for me to do is to thank you all very much for giving me the time again to speak to you about this topic and where it overlaps with, database DevOps. I hope you will be able to join us at the summit. I'm very, very excited by it, and I'm looking forward to learning more from you guys about how you manage your data privacy and protection within all of the organizations that you represent. So thanks very much for your time today, and that's the end of the webinar.